talk about MFRS 15, that is revenue from contract with customer. Okay, basically, this MFRS is a new MFRS which started in 2018, replacing the previous MFRS on the revenue. So MFRS 15 is actually replacing MFRS 118 and MFRS 111 on construction contract. Okay, this is basically the summary on the comparison between the old MFRS and the current MFRS 15 that we are applying. Okay, basically under MFRS 15, it is a revenue from contract with customers, alright, in which there are 5 steps that the entity need to comply with before they can recognize revenue from the contract. So the first step is to identify the contract with a customer. Second step, identify the performance obligation. Performance obligation means here referring to whether the business is selling goods to the customer or whether the business is providing services to the customer. So the entity need to specifically identify what is the obligation that they need to provide to the customer. The third step is to identify the transaction price. Okay, basically under the contract, the price is normally not necessarily fixed. It can be also variable. It can be fixed, it can be variable, or it can be both. Alright, like a normal selling, you normally sell your product at 100 ringgit. Okay, that's a normal transaction in sales, but in contract, that is not necessarily to be fixed at 100. It can be the price could be determined by other factors, which is variable. When we say variable, it means that the price may be changed. Okay, it reduce or more. Okay, the step 4 is to allocate the transaction price to the performance obligation in the contract. So step 4 is actually you have to refer back to the step 2 here. If in the step 2 you identify that the company has more than one obligation to the customer, therefore they need to allocate the transaction price to each of the performance obligation. If the company has only one obligation, then you may skip the allocation of the transaction price to each performance obligation. Okay, and the last step is to recognize revenue when or as the entity satisfy a performance obligation, which simply say if you sell goods, when you deliver goods, that means you have fulfilled your obligation to your customer, then only you can recognize it as revenue. If you are providing services, when you have started providing the services, then that will be considered as satisfying the obligation, then you can start recognize the revenue. So under the contract revenue, the business need to fulfill all these 5 steps before it can recognize the revenue. Okay, of these 5 steps, right, so we segregate them into 2 categories, which is recognition and measurement. So this just to make you understand that step 1, step 2, identifying contract, that the contract exists, and that you can identify what is your obligation to the customer, And when you recognize the revenue, that goes under recognition. And measurement, we talk about measurement, is about quantifying those figures into your financial statement that were referring to step 3 and 4. So this is a summary of the 5 steps where you are the entity and you are providing you are selling goods or providing services to your customer, and your customer, in return of receiving the goods or the services, the customer will pay to the entity. The consideration here is referring to the payment that is made by the customer to the entity. Alright, so step 1, you need to identify that the contract is actually exists. Okay, the contract can be in terms of written, oral, or implied from usual business practice, and it is an agreement between 2 or more parties, that is between the entity and the customer, that the entity will provide goods or services to the customer. Okay, alright, so these are the features of a contract. It must be approved and committed. Okay, each party rights is identified. That means when you sell goods to your customer or providing services, at that point you know what is the right of the customer when they receive the goods, which means that once you transfer, when you deliver the goods to the customer, then the customer will possess the rights and control over the goods. That will be considered as transferring, right, the rights or the control of the goods to the customer. Alright, and then you can identify how the entity will receive payment from the customer, that the collection is probable, and that the contract has a commercial substance. Okay, these are the 5 features to see that a contract exists. Okay, so under step 1, okay, when we identify the contract, okay, it only appears there is a contract if parties involved in the contract approve and committed to perform the obligation. Okay, you can identify the rights regarding the goods or services to be transferred, the payment terms. Okay, this is basically explaining about the 5 features of a contract. Okay, disregard revenue guidance to contract if the contract is wholly unperformed. That means the entity unable to fulfill its obligation to the customer, or the party each party, which refers to the business or the customer, can unilaterally terminate the contract without compensation. Okay, which you can cancel the contract without the need to pay to any parties. Then if this condition happen, therefore would say that the contract does not exist, and therefore you cannot recognize it as revenue. Okay, so this is further explaining about the contract. Right, the company obtain rights to receive consideration. Okay, when you talk about rights, company obtain right when you deliver the goods to the customer. Company have the right to receive payment, and then the customer have the right to use and benefit from the goods that they receive from the business. Okay, and this right and performance obligation give rise to an asset or net liability, in which it gives rise to the contract asset and contract liability. Okay, to be continued.